Hello and welcome. My name is Retro, and today I am finally recording my next video in my How to Damage series. I wanted to record this ages ago, much closer to after when I released my first one, How to Damage Basics. But because I knew the way damage was being, the way damage worked in the game was being changed in the update that just happened, I had to delay this video by like 2 months almost, or maybe even longer actually. But now we're finally here and we're finally getting to it. And in this video, I will be explaining damage types and everything there is to know about them, including their status effects. Last video I did say that the kind of way I'm doing this series is I'm making like a bunch of different videos that kind of cover a different part of the way damage works in this game. And some videos may be prerequisites, if you would liken it to a uni course, I suppose, as other videos. This video is not a prerequisite. The last video, sorry, is not a prerequisite for this video. So I will not be assuming you have the knowledge of any of the information I talked about in the last video. And if I am talking about any of the information that was in the last video, I will re-explain it here. However, for the next video, both this video and the last video will be somewhat of prerequisites, and I will assume you have all the information from this and the last video for the next video that will be coming in this series. Anyway, I have a lot to talk about, so let's get into it. First of all, I would like to talk about what I've noticed to be the most common misunderstanding people have about how damage works in this game. I've seen people time and time again have this misunderstanding, and I've had to explain it to people a bunch, so I wanted to start the video off of this and get it out of the way. And that's the fact that damage types and their status effects are different. They are not the same thing. A lot of people seem to be confused by this and seem to think they're the same thing. Recently, in my Blast vs. Slash video, one of my recent videos, I explained that Slash doesn't scale as well against health than other damage types such as heat or gas. And obviously, and maybe I didn't make it clear in the video, but I was referring to the Slash status effect as the Slash. I was specifically relating to viral slash, not just slash, and the viral slash doesn't actually use slash as DPS, it uses the slash status effect. And however, I had someone in my comment section say that slash did scale well with health before the update because it gained extra damage to certain health types like Clone First and Infested. And although they were right, slash did gain extra damage, this is an example of them being confused by not understanding the difference of slash and its status effect, as slash did gain extra damage to those health types, but viral slash builds don't kill enemies with slash damage. They killed enemies with the slash status effect, which doesn't actually do slash damage, it does true damage. Another example is ages ago, I had someone that completely wrote off radiation as a damage type because they thought that radiation didn't actually damage enemies, but instead it just made enemies turn on each other because that's what the status effect does. Where I had to explain to him that at the time, though this isn't true anymore, radiation was the best damage type when it came to bosses, as most bosses had alloy armor, which radiation was really good against. Damage types are the actual damage instance of your weapon. They actually affect the damage of your actual weapon, and different damage types may be neutral, weak, or strong against different factions. Status effects are debuffs that weapons can apply onto enemies depending on their status chance and the damage types that weapon does. For example, a weapon can only apply the status effect of a damage type that weapon does. They are two different things, and it should not be thought of them as being the same. Builds can be broken up into raw damage builds and damage over time builds. Damage over time builds use damage over time status effects to kill enemies, while raw damage use the actual damage types themselves to kill enemies. And they are different. Status effects don't even have the same names as the damage types that they get applied by. For example, the status effect of slash isn't called slash, it's called bleed. Anyway, now that that's under the way, let me cover all the different damage types in the game, and if they have any additional perks that distinguish them from the different damage types in the game. So to begin with, there are 13 main damage types and an additional 3 secret damage types, which making up a total of 16 damage types. Each damage type, as I already said, may be neutral, weak, or strong to one of the different factions, as each faction in the game has some form of resistance or weaknesses to different damage types. These damage types are broken up into different categories. To begin with, we have the physical damage types. These are impact, puncture, and slash. These damage types are often referred to as IPS, which literally just stands for impact, puncture, and slash. Next, we have the 4 primary elements. You mod these on with simple just mods that will give you one of these 4 elements. To begin with, we have heat, then we have electric, cold, and then finally toxic. Toxic, however, has a unique property that other damage types don't have, and this is that it will bypass shields. It bypasses both enemy shields and Warframe shields, so Toxic is very dangerous to us as players, as it will be capable of one-shotting us, because normally our shield stops that from happening. But if you have something like Overguard, or if you're Nidus, or if you have a Naris Augment on, or something like that, obviously you still won't be able to be one-shot, as Overguard will stop Toxic, and other forms of gating will also stop Toxic. Just shields won't be able to stop Toxic. And then there are 6 secondary damage types. The secondary damage types are combinations of 2 of the primary damage types. Think of primary and secondary colors. Secondary colors are a combination of 2 of the 3 primary colors. These secondary damage types are Blast, which is formed from cold and heat, Corrosive, which is formed from toxic and electric, Gas, which is formed from toxic and heat, Magnetic, which is formed from cold and electric, Radiation, which is formed from heat and electric, and Viral, which is formed from cold and toxic. None of these secondary elements have actual mods that just give you that secondary element. You have to use the 2 mods of the 2 primary elements that you use to mix it to get that secondary element on your weapon, with the exception of Radiation. Each weapon type in the game does have a Radiation mod, which gives radiation to the damage as the mod itself, plus an additional stat. They're really cool, really useful mods. So those were the 13 main damage types, but in addition to that, there are an additional 3 secret damage types that you can't mod for on your weapons. The first one and the most accessible of these 3 is Void Damage. Void Damage usually can only be done by your operator through your amps. However, Zaku's abilities do Void Damage, and the ability Zata's Whisper, which is a helmet ability that can be put on any Warframe, will give you Void Damage for all your weapons. Void does have additional perks, just like Toxic. However, it only does for the amp variety of it. So the Void Damage that Zaku's abilities do, or the Void Damage you get from Zata's Whisper, don't have these perks, but Void Damage from Operator Amps do. These perks are being able to break Eidolon plus Rhopalopolis shields, being able to change Profitaker's damage adaptation, and also being able to get rid of the damage resistance that Sentience and Shadowstalker can build up. Next, we have True Damage. True Damage can only be gotten from certain abilities. There is also at least one weapon that has a perk that allows it to deal true damage, and also from the slash status effect. True Damage does have no damage reductions. True Damage is not weakened by any enemy health type or faction, or is it buffed by an enemy faction, and it is not lowered by any enemy reduction in any way. That includes armor, meaning it ignores armor. Essentially, True Damage does the true damage of your weapon, hence the name. And then lastly, we have Tau. Tau is a damage type that we as players cannot do. It is the only damage type that players cannot do, and only Sentience can deal this damage type. Okay, next up, I'm going to cover each of the faction types and which weaknesses the faction types have. Basically, the way this works, as if an enemy is weak to a faction type, the damage that the weapon does, that is that faction type, will be increased by 50%, basically giving your weapon even more damage against that faction. However, if your enemy is resistant to that faction type, the damage of that damage type will be decreased by 50%, effectively lowering the damage of your weapon by enemies. This is how damage types work. Status effects are different from this. I just wanted to reiterate that point. There are 8 factions in the game currently. However, the 3 main factions, being Grineer, Corpus, and Infested, each have a sub-faction. The 8 factions are, of course, Grineer, which is weak to corrosive and impact, but has no resistances. Its sub-faction is Kuva Grineer, found on the Kuva Fortress and the Zeramin, and they are also weak to corrosive and impact. However, they gain the resistance to heat. Corpus is the next faction, which is weak to puncture and magnetic. The Corpus sub-faction is Amalgam Corpus, which is found on Jupiter, and they are weak to magnetic and electric, while also being resistant to blast. So the Amalgam Corpus are no longer weak to puncture, instead they are weak to electric, and they are resistant to blast. Infested is the next faction, which is weak to heat and slash. However, the Deimos Infested is their sub-faction found on the Deimos open world, which are weak to gas and blast, while also being resistant to viral. So they are no longer weak to heat and flash, instead they are weak to blast and gas, and they are resistant to viral. The next faction is Orokin, which is weak to viral and puncture, but they are resistant to radiation. Sentience is up next, which is weak to radiation and cold, while being resistant to corrosive. Nama is next, being weak to toxic and slash, while being resistant to magnetic. Murmur is next, being resistant to radiation and electric, but being weak to radiation and electric, but being resistant to viral. And last is Zeramin, which is weak to void. Zeramin refers to Thrax and the Void Angels, not the actual Grineer or Corpus that you find on the Zeramin. The Grineer on the Zeramin are Kuva Grineer, and the Corpus enemies are just regular Corpus enemies. Every damage type in the game, except for true damage and Tau damage, is strong against some type of enemy in the game. However, not all damage types is weak to all types, or at least one type of enemy in the game. Additionally, Overguard will stop any of these buffs or resistance apply enemies, as Overguard on enemies have its own set of resistance. It's basically neutral across the board for each damage type except for Void, which it is weak to. Now, lastly, we will be moving on to the main course, the status effects. Now, as I said, status effects are debuffs applied to enemies. Each time your weapon attacks and hits an enemy, it has a chance to apply one of the status effects of the damage types it does, based on your weapon status chance. So if you have above 100% status chance, you have a chance of actually applying more than one status effect on each hit. These statuses, starting off with impact, the status effect for impact is called stagger. Remember, the damage type is different from the status effect, and they even have different names. Impact is the damage type, stagger is the status effect of impact. I just really want to hammer that point home. Stagger can stack up to 5 times and last for 6 seconds. Each new proc will replace old procs if you have 5 procs on it. Stagger will stagger enemies for a duration, and each additional proc applied to enemies will increase the duration of the stagger. Additionally, if stagger is applied to heavy enemies such as Eximus units, the threshold required to pass on kill them will be increased by 8%. Puncture's status effect is called weakened. Weakened can be applied up to 5 times on enemies and last 6 seconds each. The first proc of Weaken will lower enemies' damage output by 40%. Each additional proc will further lower enemies' damage output by 10%, making it so that they lose 80% of their damage at a full 5 procs, meaning they'll only do 20% of the total damage they could be doing. In addition to this, each proc applied by each weakened proc will give your weapons a 5% absolute crit chance buff for each proc, so capping out at a 25% absolute crit chance buff at 5 procs. What an absolute crit chance proc means is it's a flat number applied to your crit chance after mods. So if your modded crit chance is 50%, attacking an enemy with 5 weakened procs will increase your crit chance to 75%. The slash status effect is called bleeding. It lasts for 6 seconds and has no cap on the amount of stacks you can apply on it. It applies a damage over time effect, or dot for short, on enemies. The dot has a 1 second delay before it starts to damage enemies, but after that 1 second delay, it will apply 1 damage tick each second. The damage that the dot does is equal to 35% of the weapon's modded damage. And there are also additional modifiers that can go into that, like faction damage, but we're not going to consider that for slash, or any of the other damage over time status effects. Now, this status effect does true damage, not slash, and since it does do true damage, it will ignore all of enemies' damage reductions, like armor. The heat status effect is called Ignite, and get ready because this one's a big one. It lasts for 6 seconds and does not have a cap, just like slash. Enemies infected with Ignite will panic for a set time. The duration depends on the actual enemy that is infected by it. While they are panicking, they will be completely CC'd, unable to activate any of their abilities or attack. Additionally, enemies infected with Ignite will have their armor slowly stripped over time, reaching a max armor strip of 50% after 2 seconds. Once the Ignite status effect wears off, enemies will then slowly start to regain their armor. This armor strip is multiplicative with other forms of armor strips. So for example, if you have an ability that strips armor by 90%, the Ignite status effect will then further strip their armor by 5% of what's left of their armor. So in total, you'd only get a 95% armor strip, not a full armor strip. Lastly, the heat status effect has a damage over time effect, just like slash. It will have a 1 second delay before damaging the enemies, and after that 1 second delay, it will deal 1 damage tick per second to the enemies. The damage of the status effect is equal to 50% of the weapon's modded damage. Unlike other status effects, other damage over time status effects in the game, which all work that each proc on the enemy functions as its own damage over time, has its own tick, and has its own duration, Heat, however, will group all the procs instances of itself on an enemy into one collective damage over time. Adding a new proc to the stack will refresh the duration of the status effect, while also adding more damage to the damage over time that it does. Because of this, it can inherit some of the traits and attributes of different weapons if you apply heat status effects by multiple different weapons. This is called heat inherent. The next status effect is electric. Its status effect is called Tesla Chain. It lasts for 6 seconds and once again has no cap. Enemies affected by a Tesla Chain will be stunned for about 3 seconds and will not be able to perform any action, just like how they would be if they were panicked. Enemies infected by Tesla Chain will not only receive a damage over time themselves, but additionally, any enemy within 3 meters of them will also receive that same damage over time. The damage over time does 50% of the modded damage, and unlike Heat and Slash and some other damage over times, it does not have a delay before it starts actually damaging enemies. Cold status effect is called Freeze, and it is the only one of the 4 primary damage types that is not a damage over time. It can stack up to 10 times, and the stacks last for 10, and each proc lasts for 6 seconds. The first proc will slow enemies by 50, and will give your weapon a 0.1 absolute crit damage buff. This works similarly to the crit chance buff you get from Puncture. For example, if your weapon has a modded crit damage buff of 5, attacking an enemy with 1 cold proc will increase your crit damage to 5.1. After each additional proc will further slow enemies by 5% and will increase the crit damage buff by 0.05. At 9 procs, the slow and the damage buff cap out at 90% and 0.5. However, if you apply a 10th cold proc on enemies, enemies will be completely frozen for 3 seconds, and the damage buff, the crit damage buff that the status effect applies will go up to 1. Instead of 0.5, which you get from 9 procs, it will just be an increase by 1. After the freeze wears off, enemies will be left with 3 cold procs. Toxic status effect is poison. Toxic poison deals a damage over time to enemies, dealing toxic damage with a 1-second delay, just like slash and heat. The damage over time does do 50% of the enemy of your weapon's modded damage. Since this poison does deal toxic damage, just like toxic itself, poison will also bypass shields. Last is our first secondary damage type, elemental damage type, and its status effect is called Detonate. It recently got changed in the update. It used to be called Inaccuracy and have a completely different effect, but the new effect is Detonate. Enemies inflicted with Detonate will cause a small explosion centered around them after 1.5 seconds, dealing 30% of your weapon's damage. If enemies die, or if you apply 10 Detonate procs on enemies before that 1.5 seconds runs out, a big 5-meter explosion will be caused, forcefully ending the duration of all status effects and dealing 300% of the damage. Corrosive status effect is called Corrosion. You can apply up to 10 stacks of Corrosion, and each stack lasts for 8 seconds. The first proc of Corrosion will armor strip enemies by 26%. Additional procs from Corrosive will further armor strip enemies by 6%. At 10 procs, you will fully armor strip enemies by 80%. If, however, you use 2 Emerald Shards, as Emerald Shards can increase your max Corrosive proc by 2, and you can use 2 to make your max Corrosive procs 14, which will fully armor strip enemies, as it will strip enemies by 104%. Additionally, Hydra's passive has the ability to make the first Corrosive proc strip enemies' armor by 50%, also allowing him to fully armor strip enemies with Corrosive. Gas's status effect is called Gas Cloud. Gas Cloud will last 6 seconds and can stack up to 10 times. Gas Cloud will deal damage to enemies each tick for each second, without any delay like electric, towards the enemy inflicted by it and any other enemy within 3 meters. Each additional proc from Gas Cloud will further increase the range of the Gas Cloud by 0.3 meters, capping out at 6 meters at 10 procs. The dot does 100% of the weapon's damage. Gas Cloud additionally also can headshot enemies. However, the headshot multiplier for Gas Cloud is only 1 times. But the headshot multiplier can be affected by arcanes and mods like Primary Deadhead. It will also proc Primary Deadheads, as it's capable of getting headshot kills. When a host inflicted by Gas Cloud dies, the status effect will linger around their dead body and will still deal for the remaining duration of the status effect, and will still deal the damage over time effect to any enemy within range of the status effect. Magnetic status effect is called Disruption. It lasts for 6 seconds, and it can be applied up to 10 times on enemies. The first proc of Disruption will increase the damage dealt to enemies' overguards and shields by 100%. Each additional proc will further increase that extra damage by 25%, capping out at 325% extra damage to enemies' health, shields, and overguard. When shields or overguard breaks on the enemies, the target is dealt 3% of the overguard or shields that they had for each magnetic proc they had, and it will apply a electricity status effect on them. At 10 procs, the electricity damage dealt to them is capped out at 30%. Radiation status effect is called Confusion. The radiation status effect has the longest duration at 12 seconds and can apply 10 times. Confusion will make enemies target all units, meaning they can target other enemies, but they can still also target yourself or your fellow allies. However, enemies inflicted by Confusion will gain a damage buff specifically towards other enemies. The first proc will make that damage buff 100%, but every additional proc after that will further increase that damage buff by 50, capping out at 550% extra damage. If confusion is used on bosses and things like acolytes, instead of increasing the damage they deal to enemies, it will increase the damage enemies deal to them, as enemies that aren't inflicted by confusion will also target enemies that are infected by confusion. Viral status effect is called Virus, and it works very similar to Magnetic. It stacks up to 10 times and lasts for 6 seconds. The first proc will increase all damage dealt to enemies' health by 100%. Additional procs will increase that damage buff by 25%, capping out at 325%. So Viral works the exact same as Magnetic without the additional effect that Magnetic has, dealing electricity damage to enemies, but on enemies' health instead of enemies' shields and overguard, which Magnetic does. Magnetic seems like it might be a bit better than Viral, but consider that not every enemy has overguard or shields, but every enemy has health. Void status effect is called Bullet Attractor. It will create a bubble around enemies with a radius. It will create a 2.5 meter bubble around enemies for 3 seconds, centered on where you shot the enemy. Every bullet that then goes in that bullet attractor bubble will redirect the bullet directly to the center of the bubble. Meaning, if you shoot an enemy's head and you apply the bullet attractor status effect on the enemy's head, you basically create a much larger headshot target for yourself. Neither true damage or Tau have a status effect. So that is all for this video. I do hope this was informative and you may have learned something from this video. Again, last time, would like to hammer home, damage types are different from their status effects. They are not the same thing, and they should not be considered as such. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video, do consider checking out my other video, and if you haven't already, and you're newer to the game, maybe also check out my How to Damage build. The How to Damage Basics build is targeted more heavily towards very new players, but this video could be useful for new players, mid-game players, and even some early late-game players. And also check out my Twitch channel where I stream from time to time, and maybe check out my Let's Play channel where I play some other games. And until next time, bye-bye!